So, I mean, just to continue on the same front, since you have a, different experience in different
Yeah.
industries. So
Mhm.
especially with the marketing aspect, I want to understand like how marketing or the brand marketing or the entire overall marketing is different from industries to industries. Like, you can take up like, from your experience or like fintech,
Yeah.
edtech, health tech or e-com, like how the marketing perspective is different for each one of them.
So, I mean, you're right, Pranay. I mean, that bit, there are some sort of differences. And particularly for me, if I was to just talk about moving from edtech to e-commerce, there are, for me personally, working on an app product and then moving to actually physical products. I manage a brand
Right.
that, sells men's lifestyle products, right? So quite a difference there versus, consumer behavior. The consumer behavior of a user who's buying a 30,000 rupee course versus maybe 100 rupee pair of earrings is completely different. But I think the fundamentals of marketing remain the same, right? And if I was to break that into say 4 points, one is, identifying the consumer pain point. The second is unearthing actual consumer insights that can help the brand land its point, right? And the third is, to be able to craft a brand story in a compelling way and tell that story, right? And the fourth is basically channel distribution, right? Which is how do you effectively tell customers
Right.
that story, right? And that's what channel distribution is. And you're right, it's different across different sectors. But what I think really changes between categories is the external factors. Because let's take fintech as a category, right? Fintech itself is a low trust category. So if you want to build a fintech leader, you have to build a brand based on trust, right? And I think e-commerce did that really well very early on. They had this problem very early on, and they did it really well by some, fantastic initiatives at that time, like cash on delivery and zero cost EMI, right?
Right.
So I think now those problems have evolved for e-commerce, right? Today it's about how do you marry selection and convenience with differentiation, because now consumers have access to all products across channels, across e-commerce players, right? It's the field is basically leveled, right? So I think the changes really are in the external factors. And I think where marketing can really add value is you stay true to the fundamentals, which is the core of it is really the pain point and the insight.
Right. Right.
And then you optimize for the external factors, right? Which is how do you sort of build a brand differently in the fintech space versus an e-commerce space, right? Where differentiation might be key, where brand building might be key, versus fintech, where trust might be more important. Yeah.
Right. Right. I mean, yeah, I mean, understanding the persona, understanding the pain point, addressing that, building
Yeah.
up insights, and then, working towards building it and solving a problem is what, every player is trying to do. But I was always curious, like, how, branding perspective changes from industry to industry. But yeah. So Shweta, I mean, see, one is the branding, which we are talking about different industries. Then, there is a new age startup that, India is now has produced over 100 unicorns and, you
Mm-hmm.
know, more than there were in just the last year.
Yeah.
So how at different stages also, it's not just the branding that is done for a particular industry or particular company, but at different stages also the branding changes, right? When you are at a seed stage, when then you become a series 8 till you go to your eighth series before
Yeah.
whatever you get for an IPO. So how at different stages, like could you explain us like how the branding changes or the perspective changes?
Yeah. I think how it changes really depends on, you're right, the stage of the startup and the requirement, right? Pre-seed, I mean, you technically have a product that's not even achieved PMF, right? So the story that you might tell
Right. Right.
may change, right?
Hmm.
Between series A and series B, your goal is to really establish unit economics and create a glide path to revenue growth, right? So there you're really focused on telling a consumer story that's meaningful, right? And I think it's okay for startups and brands to do things that are not scalable at that point, right? Why? Because at that stage, building this meaningful connection with the consumer, I think, is absolutely critical, right? Because you've already achieved PMF at that stage. And then later on, I think it's really about scaling up, right? When you want to step on the gas, then you go, all out, you go to mass media, you have obviously an overarching story, but that overarching story can really be customized across channels, right?
Right.
And
Right.
while I think the articulation may vary, the positioning and the essence really remains the same, right? And I think that at that stage is when, when what we call a mature startup, you have your story straight, right? I think
Right.
at that point, it's just about being consistent and reaching a larger larger number
Audience.
of people, right? Because
Mm.
reach isn't optional today, right? Because for
Right.
brands to be relevant, you need to have the reach, you need to drive consistency, and you need to have a message that really resonates with the consumer.
Right. And the consumer, which is ever changing. I
Yeah.
mean, next point which I want to bring up is the user behavior, right? And
Right.
I would like to start with an example of Unacademy, for instance, right? So
Mm.
Unacademy in a tech space always was a complimentary course for people. We never believed that we will change the offline course when
Mm.
Unacademy started. Or like we are a more a supplement course, you do your college school and we are into a test prep and you can come and take us as an assistant
Mm.
material, study material. But, then we were nicely placed when the COVID peak started, when
Mm.
the COVID era started, we were nicely placed to, take a flight from there. But, suddenly from the market TAM from 8%, it became 100% for us, like for an academy, right? So like everyone was online and we were already there to be presented. And, it lasted for a good 1.5, 2 years plus.
Yeah.
So has that changed the user behavior completely now since we are coming back to offline? And this is just one part, one industry I'm talking about, let's suppose an
Yeah.
academy. And I'm sure this is applicable for other players and industries as
Sure
well.
is.
Like,
Yeah.
the buying behavior has completely changed. So how much do you think, especially the COVID era, has brought a digital adoption, especially this phone pay, Google Pay, and UPIs, and retails? How the adoption and the user behavior has changed over, especially for all the online startups.
Yeah. I think Pranay, honestly, it's the first time in a generation, and probably in the history of Indian consumers, that
Right.
users have had access to faster, cheaper data. And tech integration is more ubiquitous. You gave the examples of UPI, right? So I think it's the first time, like I said, in the history of Indian consumers, that this trifecta has really come together
Right.
at the same time, right? And this has expanded the average Indian consumer's expectation and perception of what a brand is
Hmm.
really about and what it actually means for them, right? So I think what they're doing is not benchmarking a brand against other Indian brands, right? They're benchmarking an Indian brand against global brands because now they have access to that. And those are the expectations, right? Because they know how global brands are sort of the kind of treatment that consumers get from global brands, right? And that's the real benchmark, right? And I think the mobile itself is a window to the world, right? I mean, it's all about forming communities and articulating the demands that customers have in crowdspeak, right? And I think crowdspeak now is really how the communication of brands are really dictated, right? Because now uh, ratings, reviews, feedback on neutral third party platforms, things have become so critical, right? So I think that's a huge stick that consumers have against brands to sort of keep them in line, right? So while I think it's important as marketers to craft that narrative and tell that story, I think today consumers really have a lot more power
Right.
on
Right.
brands, right? I think that's what has really changed, right? So brands really have to, while COVID and the pandemic has really accelerated digital adoption, I
Hmm.
think brands now need to be extra careful, right? Because it's not just about solving for a pain point. You also want to solve for it better than other competitors. You also want to solve it in the best possible way that a consumer might want that problem solved, if you know what I
Right.
mean.